Hello everyone, and welcome to the Top 15 Metrics for a Successful Distribution Operation webinar series. This is part 2. Today's webinar is hosted by ExtenData and International Telematics. My name is Georgia Brown. I'm the Director of Marketing here at ExtenData. Our first presenter is Daryl Wilson, Senior Solutions Architect and Product Manager here at ExtenData.
Hello, everyone.
And our second presenter is David Blackwell, Product Manager at International Telematics.
Hello.
I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsors today. Thank you for making this possible, and we appreciate your support. So we have 7 of the top 15 topics that we're going to cover today. First is improving efficiency, starts with route optimization, then weight and impact on delivery operations, understanding fuel economy, increase the fuel mileage efficiency of your fleet, reduce the cost of accidents, move from reactive to proactive, the reality of an aging driver workforce, and keep the wheels turning. So before we get into David's first topic, we have a poll. And that is, do you currently monitor your vehicle miles per trip remotely? So David, why don't you speak to this a little bit for us?
Sure. So we're talking about doing it remotely. I'm going to guess that most companies are monitoring their vehicle miles, but doing it remotely, I'm going to guess about probably less than half are doing that today. When we talk about monitoring vehicle miles remotely, we're talking about using technology to see how my drivers are traveling on the route, and then using that information to, really to evaluate how efficient they're being.
Okay. So you said less than half you believe will be monitoring remotely?
I think so.
Okay. So it looks like we still have a couple votes coming in, but I'm going to go ahead and close it. And I would say 36% of the audience is saying yes. So why don't you dive into that topic a little bit for us?
Sure. So we're talking today, the first milestone we're talking about, the first metric that we're talking about is route optimization. And this does have to do with using technology to make sure that I'm getting the most revenue per hour per driver. One of the important things to start with is what is your average stop time per customer site. If you have the tools to do that today, to look at what your stop time is, you'll know. If you don't have technology that's telling you what your average stop time per customer is, it begins to be difficult to determine what your target should be. Maybe you have a target in mind that your stop time should be 15 minutes. Using the data available through telematics to monitor and to look for exceptions is an important part of optimizing a route. If you're using an automated route tool, a couple of the reasons that you might want to use one of them is to increase your stops per hour by making sure that your routes are structured in a way that reduces overlap. You want to make sure that you don't have drivers crossing each other as much as possible. Making sure that your stops are organized in a way that you can achieve the optimum number of stops in a route. Of course, some of this is going to depend on how much product is going to be delivered, what your customer window delivery times are. And then the final goal is to reduce your overall miles per stop. Once you've optimized your route based on truck routes, and that's important too, is that you're using a software that's based on your trucks, the size of your trucks, the weight of your trucks, as well as things like delivery window and customer location. Once you've optimized your route, you've got a starting point for what is your target for achieving the most with the fewest miles.
Yeah, and David, another point to bring up on this too has to do with actually calculating and managing what your planned route was versus what the actual plan was. So what did the driver actually do, and how compliant was he with that initial plan?
Absolutely, and that's where technology comes into play. Thanks for bringing that up, Daryl. So to really make use of a route optimization, you've got a planned route, and then what did your drivers actually do? Taking information about what your drivers did on the route, how long they stopped. Maybe they stopped longer at a particular customer site than you had anticipated. Are there traffic conditions or any other factors that are preventing a driver from performing the route that you had planned for them? So taking that feedback in order to make adjustments to your route and to hopefully, in the long run, we're talking about reducing costs and reducing the number of miles. And that's actually the benchmark for this metric, is reducing the miles per trip. I know that case studies for us have shown that just out of the gate, using a route optimization software can reduce the overall cost anywhere from 8%, that's the low figure, up to 15%. So implementing a route optimization, whether you have static routes or you have routes that are built the day before, this is a big win. And a lot of what we're going to be talking today is built all on using that data that Gerald just talked about, the actual route, but it does start with route optimization.
Great. So our next topic is talking about weight and its impact on your delivery operations. Weight can play a large factor in determining the efficiency of your fleet. Really, this comes into play based on the types of products that you deliver. If you deliver, large or heavy products that make it, increase the weight of your load as well as make it difficult for your driver to deliver that product, that has a bearing on a lot of these metrics that we've talked about. So weight really has an initial application here, as it really, you have to take into account the equipment that you're using, the truck and or trailer that's being used, and making sure that you're not overloading that, but then also distances traveled, the stops per route, and so on. Another factor with that is stop time, and then potentially driver or vehicle performance as well. Weight is also a factor that has to be taken into account for routing. So we just talked about route optimization, and a solid route optimization solution would be taking route or weight into account as you sort out and optimize the number of stops on a route. This is also a factor, just in ensuring that the vehicle is compliant with the routes that are being driven. We never want to end up with the wrong vehicle on a street or a bridge that can't handle the weight of that vehicle. And then lastly, weight is a factor of your delivery process and the workflow for the driver. In the case where you have, heavy product and, it limits how many the driver can, literally move from the truck into the customer location at a single point in time, can really lengthen the time of the stop, and therefore that really has to be taken into account when we go through this process of trying to optimize these routes.
Daryl, I just want to chime in just from a vehicle perspective. What about load weight on a vehicle performance? I know you talked about routing. Should vehicle weight be considered when you're looking at your vehicle performance?
Yeah, it absolutely has to be taken into account. Obviously, if you have heavier loads, that is going to require more of the vehicle, which will then likewise potentially produce lower fuel economy. So, in working through that process, it's important to understand, okay, is weight a factor for all of my routes or just a portion of my routes? And then what equipment's being used to fulfill and deliver the products on those routes, and is it the optimal equipment for that to increase or utilize fuel efficiency? So the benchmarks for this, really is, primarily this issue of understanding weight per stop and weight per route, and knowing how that's impacting you going forward. Understanding what your current situation is with that, how many routes is the weight impacting, and what are the current values that are associated with that, and then monitoring that on a regular basis to understand if there's any changes in your product, any changes in the routes with the addition of customers, as well as how your drivers are doing with that.
Thanks, Daryl. So we have another poll, which is, does your company have a policy on idle time? So David, this is going to be your next benchmark here. What do you think the result of this poll will be?
I'm going to hope that most folks do have a policy. Whether we'll talk about whether they have the tools to be able to actually implement that. But I'm going to guess that almost everybody has a policy on idle time.
Okay. So we have the majority of the audience, and it looks like it only went out by a mere 3%. So 53% of the audience said yes.
Wow, I am surprised. Actually, that's good to know, though. I'm glad to know that because we're going to talk about fuel economy and as our next metric, our third metric, and idle time is actually a big part of that. It's one of the biggest, has one of the biggest impacts on fuel economy. So, you know, it really does start for this metric. It starts with having a policy on idle time, and of course, it's going to be different for every fleet. There are, for example, environmental factors that are going to impact what your policy is. Just for an example, if it's in the middle of the winter in the Northeast, you're going to have idle time to warm up your tractors. It's just going to happen. But understanding that, if you have a terminal in, you know, let's say in Chicago, for example, in winter, what I should see is I should see an average across my fleet of what the idle time should be. So for, let's say, for example, you do have a policy, you know, taking out the environmental factor, you do have policy on idle that maybe drivers are not to idle more than 15 minutes. What you're going to see, what we've seen, is that there's a big difference between your top performing drivers, sometimes as much as 30% of your top performing drivers, and your lower performing drivers. So if you're going to look at fuel economy, you do have to take idle into consideration. And the reason why we say you have to do that is because idle time has a huge impact on how much fuel you're using, and then there's a hidden cost that you're actually taking away from the life of your vehicle. You know, every engine hour that you use, whether it's a reefer or a vehicle, this is one less hour that you'd be able to use that asset throughout the life of the vehicle. So there's some huge reasons to reduce idle. Some ways to do that, some different approaches we'll talk about on another metric. But this is I would say, you know, with the fleets that I work, an easy win on the fleets that I work with for improving fuel economy. Another one is driver performance. Everything from not just idle, but also speeding, the way that they're using the vehicle, and driver performance. When you improve driver performance, things that are in the driver's control, things like voluntary idle time, speeding, it does result in fuel savings. So that's another good thing to focus on is driver performance. There are idle factors that are not in the driver's control. One of them being idle time spent waiting for a customer. If you have a refrigerated load and your customer is just not ready for your driver to unload, that kind of circumstance is not in your driver's control, but that's where technology comes into play, being able to monitor idle time and then being able to address that, having actionable intelligence on idle that's happening at maybe a particular customer to be able to work to reduce that. Maybe you need to give the customer advance notice when your driver's approaching. You know, maybe it's a discussion with a customer about you might have an agreement in place that you've never been able really to use because you didn't have you weren't watching idle. Maybe you already have an agreement with how much with a readiness agreement with how much time you should have to spend on site before they're ready to receive. So it is important outside of drivers to understand what's leading to idle time, but driver performance improvement is a big part of that. So idle, speed, the way vehicles are being used, a lot of that, if you want to know where to start, and this is a thing that folks don't sometimes think about, is using your CSA scores. You know, in a role with our customers, we do a lot of consultation, and we rely heavily on CSA scores as a starting indicator for what area can they tackle first that will give them the biggest return. So for instance, driver safety. A very high driver safety score as part of your CSA scores will usually indicate that there's a problem with speeding across your fleet. So other than the impact that it has on your CSA score, speeding is a good area to tackle to reduce the wear on vehicles, but also on how you're using fuel. So using CSA scores to identify what your pain points are, and then creating best practices around that. Creating behavior best practices is key. Identifying what your idle time goal is, and then letting your drivers know, not just your drivers, but also supervisors, shift leaders, your safety folks know that, what the policy is and that you're going to start looking at it. Just right off the bat, letting folks know that you're going to start looking at it is going to result in an improvement. Folks will start behaving differently when they know that it's something that you're looking at. CSA scores are also important. We provide a tool, for example, related to over-the-road speed that directly ties in with safety meetings. So you can gauge the effectiveness of driver coaching and things like safety meetings by looking at the telematics data after one of those meetings. If one of the things you're trying to reduce is idle time, for example, if you have a meeting with your drivers on that, I would expect over the following 2 weeks to see an improvement. And if I see one of these items that we've talked to drivers about creeping back up, speed creeping back up, for example, or idle, then we know it's time for another meeting. So understanding what those factors are is a starting point, and then we'll talk about how you can actually improve that.
David, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, one of the driver behaviors around reducing speed and how that can have an impact on routing and overall time it takes to deliver the entire load.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up, Daryl. And I think that ties into what you mentioned earlier about tying in actual route performance to what my planned route performance was. We don't want drivers to be trying to get to their next stop at any cost. We don't want them driving safely. We want them to safely get to their next stop on time. And understanding what kind of pressure we're putting on drivers to accomplish a goal is important. This comes down to driver coaching, making sure that we're setting realistic goals. We don't need a driver to be speeding unsafely to get to the next stop, but what we do need to understand is what are the factors that are leading up to that. So that using that actual route data and looking at things like what route are they taking? Are they taking the route that you had planned? If not, why? And then, usually what we find is that there's a stop previously that has kind of thrown the schedule off, and understanding why that's happening as well. So what are the benchmarks for understanding fuel economy? It's going to be benchmarking what your idle time is today, using telematics data to reduce that idle time, identifying if speeding is a problem, reducing speeding, and then using your CSA scores, as I mentioned, as a tool for doing that. So that takes us right into increasing the fuel mileage efficiency of your fleet. Once we've understood the factors that impact fuel economy, how do we get our fuel efficiency up? So the first thing we want to look at is driver behavior. How are my drivers driving? There's two ways to do that. One of them is after the fact, things like driver score, which might include idle, speed, and other safety like hard accelerate, hard brake. You can do this real time. That's the way that I always recommend. For instance, we have a program called Checkmate that gives drivers real-time feedback on their driver safety score so that they can adjust their own behavior as they're driving through the day. And this is just a real simple module that will give them a starting score. Everybody starts out with the perfect score, and things like speeding would drive down that score, and things like idle would drive down that score. And drivers have an opportunity to improve before the end of their day. Driver ranking, if you have drivers that in a positive way are competitive with each other, driver ranking is very helpful for that. So on the in-cab side, when we're talking about tractors, understanding how drivers are driving using technology and then trying to drive improvement for that is going to improve your fuel mileage efficiency. On the trailer and reefer side, understanding your loading and unloading practices. So at the beginning of the day on loading, sometimes what I've seen is something that is not really considered is how are you pre-pulling your assets? Do you have somebody that just goes out to the yard at 4 a.m. and turns on all the reefers that need to be pre-cooled without a lot of consideration about when they're actually leaving the yard? I've seen folks that are new to this kind of technology discover that their assets are being pre-cooled 4 or 5 hours before the asset's leaving. So you've got room there for maybe 2 or 3 hours of extra pre-cool time that you just didn't need. And if you just multiply that over how many assets you have every day, that's a huge savings if you change the way you pre-cool. I know for us, we use an integrated reefer micro technology that allows us, there's for folks to go into the software and to pre-cool based on a schedule. So at the front end, how are we loading? Are we using our assets efficiently and loading, using them only when, enough to get down to that temperature before they leave? And then at the end, when you've delivered a product, what are the unloading practices? Am I arriving at customer sites and the customer is ready for delivery? We talked about that at our last session, part 1, about how we can improve unloading practices. But there's, as it relates to fuel mileage efficiency, there are tools available to improve the unloading practices and reduce the fuel use. This comes down to the total cost for each customer. Also monitoring the way the reefer is used between the front and the end of the trip. How is it used during the day? Are you using start-stop? Are you using continuous? Different reefer modes are going to have an impact on how much fuel is used, and why are you using that mode? Is it something that's a customer required, or is it just something that you leave up to drivers? For example, if you're using continuous, is there opportunity for using start-stop mode and save fuel that way? If it's a customer requirement to use continuous, that should be considered as part of the cost of the customer, and it's definitely something that you should still keep in mind to evaluate the cost of each type of delivery. Promoting idle reduction. So as I mentioned, just letting your drivers know that you're looking at idle, but then setting goals. If your goal is 15 minutes, for example, idle time, I know that seems a pretty easy goal, but with the way I've seen our technology implemented, we'll have customers that sometimes have up to 50% idle, and they'll set an easily achievable goal like 15 minutes to get it down, and then they'll start incrementally improving after that. I know it's anecdotal, but I have a customer that I work very closely with. They started out at 50% idle, and through driver coaching and improving circumstances that were out of the driver's control, like customer readiness, they've got idle time down to just 1.5 minutes now. And that's, after a year of work, but that's resulted in a huge savings for their company with fuel, really improving the overall operations. Overall, they're by 3% per year, but that's resulted in really hundreds of thousands of dollars of savings. And then one that I'm not sure everybody thinks about, but calculating the life cycle cost of your assets, and as your assets begin to get toward the end of life, understanding how increased maintenance, reduced fuel mileage impacts the cost of keeping that asset as opposed to replacing it. So when you factor in maintenance costs, fuel costs, and roll that up into your calculation about life cycle costs, you want to make sure that your replacement schedule for those assets makes sense against what the cost of keeping older assets is. So it's something you may already be doing, but it's you want to make sure that fuel efficiency is included in whatever calculations you make for depreciation and for replacement schedule. All right, so what is the benchmark here? I like going for the easy wins, and it's reducing idle time, whether you have refrigerated assets or whether you have vehicles. Idle time is something that's measurable, that is easily achievable with coaching and technology, and it's something that you can do gradually. Finding out what are you doing today. For example, I've worked with fleets that will implement our telematics technology and not let anybody know they've done it for the first 30 days so that they can see what they're doing today. And then setting incremental goals, maybe 10% each quarter. It's also very successful to have, if you have multiple terminals, to have terminals set their own goals. Let them know, here's how you're performing, here's how others are performing. Set your own goals for the next quarter. that tends to work really well too. So that's the easiest win for mileage efficiency, especially when you're getting started, is going to be reducing idle time.
So next we have another poll. And this is, can training reduce the likelihood of an accident? I bet I can guess what the outcome of this poll will be, but what are your thoughts, David?
Well, I know my poll answer would be yes. I'm hoping everybody's going to say yes. But you know, if this is something that you believe training can reduce it, I've got some exciting things to tell you. So hopefully, I would say, hopefully everybody's going to say yes, over 90%.
All righty. And you would be correct. We're at 100% of attendees saying yes.
Okay, well, that's good news. I mean, everybody's on board with what we're going to be talking about, which is identifying driver behavior before an accident happens. And we've called this metric moving from reactive to proactive because there's really two ways to reduce the cost of an accident. And one of them, and the one that I like to focus on, is identifying driver behavior before something happens. And then once you've identified it, using the technology, the tools to improve driver behavior. But that's what you can do today, is identify driver behavior and reduce the risk. On the other end of it, the not so exciting part of it, but the, definitely something that is a huge reduction in cost, is using data, for instance, black box technologies. We call it black box feature for our fleets that we work with, to be able to capture information when an accident does occur and be able to provide data to reduce liability. So, it could be the difference between $500,000 or multi-million-dollar lawsuit and just the cost of lawyers' fees. If you have the data of what happened prior to, at, and just after an accident, you have the tools to reduce liability. And that's the kind of feature that you never want to have to use, but you definitely want to make sure that if whatever technology you're using today, whatever telematics, you want to make sure that it includes this kind of information that would help you if an accident does occur. So I want to talk a little bit, more on the back to how do we prevent an accident. It's important to look at what kinds of behaviors, and this is all from federal studies over the years, what kind of behaviors do drivers engage in prior to a safety critical event, so prior to an accident. So we've got a lot of studies out there on what was happening just before an accident, and the numbers are, some of them are surprising, some of them are what I would expect. For example, the top of the list is text messaging. So whether you're a trucker or just a regular vehicle, if you are text messaging, you are 23 times more likely to get in an accident. And I think one of the things that surprised me that we've seen in the most recent studies is, if you look at what's number 3 on this list, interacting with a dispatching device makes you 10 times more likely to get in an accident. And this was shocking to me. It kind of speaks to how much technology has kind of infiltrated the cab. I've been on site with drivers. I've seen up to 3 screens presented to a driver. It looks more like a dispatching center rather than a truck cab. But understanding how it's great to be able to reach my driver. It's great to be able to give information to my driver and receive it. But one of the things that I know ExtenData and Internet Telematics focus on is making sure the technology is safe for the driver and does not contribute, making sure the technology itself does not contribute to an accident.
Yeah, that's a great point, David. These things are all taking place in the cab, and I mean, we deal with it with normal drivers, let alone the, over the big vehicle drivers. So it's important to try to limit what that driver is able to do. And with technology, not only can we reduce the number of devices that are in the cab and kind of eliminate some of those multiple device distractions, but then in addition to that, layer on some functionality to limit what the driver can even do with that device while the vehicle is in motion. Again, limiting, or in some cases eliminating, those distractions that can create an accident eventually.
Absolutely. So those safety considerations and those safety checks that, like you mentioned, we have built into our own technology are critical. But looking at the other items on the list, I mean, these are things that potentially are replaced by technology. So, for example, using a calculator. I know that if you're using a calculator even to calculate your hours, if you've got electronic hours service, that kind of takes the need away from a driver to worry about that, having to write down anything. If you have a point of delivery software, allows your driver, you don't have to communicate address to your driver and have them write it down. Looking at a map, there's plenty of good turn-by-turn direction software out there that would reduce the chance of the driver having to look away from the road in order to follow directions. And then, dialing a cell phone is your driver having to make calls while they're driving. Even just dialing the cell phone, studies show that it increases your driver's chance of getting an accident by 6 times. So understanding how the technology that you're using, or if you're looking for technology, these are important questions to ask, how those technologies impact driver safety, and what safeties are in place to make sure that that technology does not impact your chances of getting in an accident. So what are the benchmarks here? The biggest one is reducing your number of accidents. Through a mix of technology and event-driven driver coaching, this goes back to driver behavior, we can expect up to a 20% reduction in accidents. I say up to, but it's really more of an average. And this is, again, back to CSA score using, if driver safety is big, you should see within a couple of quarters a 20% reduction in accidents. So that's your biggest benchmark, is reducing the number of accidents. And the other benchmark, which again is one that you would hopefully never need to use, but it's your ability to determine liability. If you do have an accident, using technology to determine liability, reduce the cost of that accident, that's something that you can compare with the technology that you hopefully have implemented around that to previous accidents where you didn't have that technology. Those are both very important benchmarks for this metric.
Our next topic is talking about the reality of an aging driver workforce, and really how do you balance between dealing with that reality as well as recruiting and bringing in newer, younger drivers. Statistics are showing on a very rapid basis that the gap between the drivers that are out there and available for work and the supply or the demand that is generated by existing business, there's an ever-growing gap there. So understanding, who your drivers are and how you're going to bring in new drivers is a factor for every business moving forward. One of the first things to address really is that issue of driver churn. The cost that is associated with the process of losing a driver and bringing on a new driver is pretty great. It's not only costly from a financial perspective, but also from a time perspective, and how quickly can you, bring a driver up to speed as far as how your business functions. On top of that is the issue of trying to target and attract, the next generation of drivers. The younger generations are highly tech savvy and highly social, and these are factors that need to be considered as it relates to bringing them on board. A variety of things that come into play with that, when we can utilize technology to help train drivers, to help them do their jobs more efficiently and effectively, and then utilize tools that are associated with that to recognize a job well done as well as pay for that, are pretty important points there. And they drive right back to that first point of reducing driver churn and obviously the costs that are associated with that. And then lastly is talking about directed workflow. And again, really this is the idea that, so many people have a smartphone of one brand type or another, and there's a variety of different apps that people are used to using. So implementing technology is not nearly as risky and disruptive as it used to be. So anytime that we can put tools and technology in the hands of the drivers that help them do their jobs more effectively and more efficiently, we want to work toward that. And a lot of this really just helps the driver work through a process that doesn't require him to make decisions that you may not want him to make, but just simplifies his process not only in the cab, but during the delivery process.
Yeah, and I just want to chime in on this one because this is probably the most talked about subject this year and last year at driver trucking forums and trucking conferences. This is, the shortage of new drivers and the changing of the driver role is really a big subject. And the fact is that the job has changed. That the days of that lone wolf out on the road are really over. It's important when we're talking about everything that Gerald just touched on. Gerald, you mentioned about the technology differences and also we're attracting a different type of driver. I think that there's some changes that need to be made at the company level in order to accommodate those drivers. And you mentioned pay performance, and that and peer recognition are really the focus when we've done, the consultations that we've done. We're talking about how to implement driver safety. If drivers perform better, basing the pay on that. The return is so great with these technologies that when you tie that in to really the benefits and rewards for drivers, it's really a good match. So understanding that that because the driving role has changed and because there's really a different group we're looking to attract, there's going to need to be changes made at the company level.
Yeah, that's a great point, David. And what I would also point on top of that as well, that one of the things that we've seen in working with our customers is just the driver acceptance of some of these tools and technologies, and because things are progressing so quickly, the ability to put tools in the hands of these drivers that they actually want to use, it can really help things out as it relates to them accepting these processes and tools versus it being the pain that it maybe was prior.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Daryl. I know that years ago I would face kind of resistance when I was talking to training drivers on electronic logs, and it's just a given now. Things like electronic DVR and electronic hours service, especially when you're talking to drivers that have come from other companies, it's just almost always, without exception, recognized as a huge benefit. That I don't get any of the resistance I used to get. Drivers are like, yeah, I love using it. It really takes all the the pain out of having to keep DVIRs and logs. It's a big benefit to the driver, and I think people recognize that now.
Yep, exactly. So the benchmarks for this, pretty clear. We want to reduce driver turnover. I think there's a couple of factors related to that. The first is just understanding the demographic of your existing driver workforce and what are you facing as it relates to the departure of the older generation, and how are you addressing the issue of backfilling those jobs. And I think understanding and generating strategies that help identify ways that you can not alienate your older generation but still provide a lot of the tools and technology that the younger generations would be looking for. And again, driving back to that first point around the cost of driver churn, it's basically about 20% of the cost of a physician's annual salary to replace that employee. And that can just be really costly to these types of operations.
So the last metric we're going to talk about today has to do with maintenance, and we're calling this keeping the wheels turning. This is all around making sure that your assets are on the road as much as possible or available as much as possible. And there's a lot to look at here around maintenance and the technologies that are available for remote monitoring of the health of your vehicles. So under maintaining your vehicles, I think I hear folks talking about a lot, and you can tell you've got tools if you're using technologies, for example, that ExtenData and then we use international telematics for. real-time alerting of vehicle faults, reefer manufacturer alarms, DVIRs that come in that require maintenance. So using technology to making sure that your assets are maintained. But there's also, I don't hear people talk a lot about, is over-maintaining assets. If you do have a technology in place that allows you to remotely monitor the health of your vehicles, one of the things you might want to look at is on your company policy side for maintenance. Have you made any changes to the way that you schedule and perform maintenance? Are you using just a timeline schedule? Are you just maintaining your assets once a quarter, regardless of what kind of fault codes and alarm codes they have? So that's the first, when we're talking about over-maintaining. And the other part is based on use. Are you basing on utilization, or are you still just basing it on time? Of course, there's some maintenance that needs to be performed on a time schedule, but there's a lot of maintenance that should take into account the utilization of your assets. So on both of these, the technologies are there to be able to do this by directly connecting to your vehicle engine, to your reefer micro, to base your maintenance on what's actually going on with the engine. So one thing I do want to address for anybody that has maintenance rolled up in their lease or that leases vehicles, I think there's a myth that that they shouldn't be concerned about maintenance. It's just not something I'm concerned about. And there are some things that you'll want to do even if you do have maintenance included in your lease, because the fact is that how well your vehicles are being maintained has an impact on how well you can perform, how well you can use your vehicles for what they're supposed to be used for, which is delivering to your customers. So if you do have a lease maintenance program, making sure that your assets aren't under-maintained, which could lead into loss of productivity. Also, though, making sure they're not over-maintained, which could also lead to loss of productivity. So even if you have a lease program, understanding the trends of what's going on with your vehicles and with maintenance, identify the metrics around what is triggering maintenance, and then setting goals. So, for instance, if you have a lot of high-risk alerts, setting goals for taking care of those in a way that doesn't impact your business or has a minimal impact. So, regardless if you have your maintenance outsourced or leased or internal, I think these things are very important to look at. Another side of it is, not just finding something when the vehicle tells you, the engine tells you something's going wrong, but using electronic DVIR to identify problems before and after route, and then getting that information immediately over to whoever's doing your maintenance.
Yeah, tools like electronic DVIR can really simplify and speed up that process. When a driver identifies that there's an issue and he can provide some, additional feedback other than just a yes or no type of answer, potentially capture photographs about what the issue is, and then transfer that information back to the back office system so that the proper maintenance and vehicle staff can address that issue quickly, can be a huge benefit.
And I know the other half of that, Daryl, is getting that back to the driver in real time. So I know that that we've talked about, sending over that electronic DVIR directly to maintenance folks, and then getting it back to the driver, having the driver sign off. So processes that may have taken a week or two before could be done really same day, real time.
Yep.
So what are the benchmarks for making sure that your wheels keep turning, keeping your vehicles maintained? One of the benchmarks is equipment utilization. Looking at how once we understand that maintenance has an impact on utilization, using utilization, and this is going back to telematics and electronic DVIR to monitor what is the utilization of my fleet, and I'm maximizing that. The second benchmark is cost per mile. And this really has to do with when you build in all the maintenance costs, loss of productivity into my repair costs, making sure that I factor that into my cost per mile. I know that some folks may overlook that. This is what we would call one of those hidden costs cost per mile. We talk a lot about customers and what the cost per customer is, but when we want to really get a full picture of cost per mile, you have to include those repair costs and loss of productivity.
Well, thank you, David and Daryl. I appreciate your wealth of information. I'm sure our audience does as well. What I'm going to allow is if anybody in the audience has questions, please feel free to submit them now. And while you're submitting them, I'm going to go ahead and move to an announcement for today. As of today, Mobile Conductor and ExtenData was honored with the FL100 Award for the 4th year running. So we're really excited about that award, and if you are attending today's webinar, you're potentially going to see a press release from one source or another about that today. So it looks like we just have a couple questions. And David, Daryl, I think I'll let you guys decide who wants to tackle this. But earlier you guys were talking about reducing the number of devices in the cab, and I know this is a big thing for ExtenData, but the audience was curious as to what that exactly means. What are we discussing when we say reducing the number of devices in a cab?
Sure, I'll start with that, and David, please chime in at any point in time. Really what this focuses on is the kind of consolidation of the devices that can be in the cab. So you may have a, if you're utilizing GPS technology, there's probably a black box, but that's not something that the driver is interfacing with necessarily. But that might be directly connected to an onboard computer that would be handling hours of service or DVIR. There's also the potential for a navigation device, a TomTom or a Garmin, if that onboard computer can't handle that. There's the possibility of a proof of delivery handheld device, that the driver's using to complete the delivery process, a cell phone, calculator, camera, printer. There's a variety of things that could be in the cab that really what we want to focus on is combining that into a single device, generally an Android-based device that would accommodate and account for the applications that are associated with all those different devices. So by having a single device with a primary user interface that allows the consolidation of all those applications with a nice, easy way for that driver to move from one application to another, and really just simplify that process. And then, like we talked about before, generating higher level of driver safety by locking them out of some of those features and functions when the vehicle's moving.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is, there's the, of course, on top of the cost of having multiple devices, there's really a training cost too, both for the driver and the back end. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about of attracting and keeping drivers. There's really more and more incentive to go for a single solution, a single device in cab, a single integrated back-end solution that would it really maximizes usability with the minimum amount of training. And to be honest, technologies are at the point today for the trucking industry where they should be at the ease of use. I would put them at a level of ease of use with an app that you would download, on your smartphone. There's, the days of needing an 8-hour training on how to use a new system are really over. So and that's one of our primary focuses is, in addition to safety, is ease of use. It should be something that that actually people feel good about using, and that you don't need a 100-page manual to do. So that kind of goes back to if you have 3 or 4 devices, why? If you're providing a routing device, which I've seen, and the drivers are bringing their own, well, what's causing a driver to use maybe an aftermarket TomTom that they're just not getting with the device that you've provided with them? So that comes down to even if you have a technology in cab right now, evaluating what the cost of training on that is and how usable is it, given that this technology is rapidly changing and improving.
Great. Well, thank you for that. The rest of the questions appear to be related to slides and following up later. So what I'd like to do is once again thank our sponsors. Motorola Solutions is a a big sponsor of ExtenData, and they provide us with the mobile devices that we utilize for our mobile conductor products, as well as Zebra Technologies. They provide the ruggedized mobile printers that we use with Mobile Conductor to provide clean invoices at the time of transaction. Thank you for attending today's webinar and this series. We appreciate your time, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. This is the contact information that we have, or you can visit either website for additional information. We will be sending out the recording and the handouts tomorrow afternoon or morning. Please check your email and make sure that info@extendata.com is allowed. And if you don't see it, check your junk box as well. Thank you again for your time, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and happy holidays.